The river moved slowly past the quay in the dark, wide and brown and almost silent, carrying the last of the day's warmth down toward the sea. Along the stone edge of the wharf, a line of mooring blocks stood worn smooth at the shoulders, and the ropes that ran from them went down at a slack angle into the water, lifting and settling as the barges breathed against the current. One small lamp burned in a niche cut into the wall of the warehouse behind them, a flame the size of a fingertip, sheltered from the river air by a curved lip of brick that had been blackened by 50 years of exactly this. The air smelled of wet rope and pitch and grain dust, and under it, faint and clean, the salt of the sea 2 miles downstream. A watchman sat on an upturned basket with his back against the warm brick, not asleep and not quite awake, listening to the water work at the pilings. Every so often, the river turned something over against the stone below him, and he did not look down, because after 11 years, he knew the whole vocabulary of those small sounds, and none of them meant anything. The reflected lamplight lay on the water in a single wavering thread, stretched and gathered and stretched again. Beyond him, the town rose in low, dark blocks against the stars, and here and there a shuttered window showed a thin, bright line of lamplight along its edge, where someone was still up. The main street ran straight through the town from the river gate to the sea gate, paved with great blocks of basalt, worn into shallow dishes by generations of cartwheels. The buildings that stood along it were not the low houses of an old country town, but tall blocks of brick, 3 and 4 stories high, their windows set in neat rows and their balconies jutting out over the pavement on brackets of travertine. In the daylight, the brick was warm and red. At night, it went the color of dark wine, and the whitewashed courses between the floors made pale bands that ran away down the street and grew closer together with distance. Most of the shutters were closed. Behind them, families lay 4 and 5 to a room on straw mattresses, and the day's heat came slowly out of the walls all night long, so that the upper floors stayed warm until the hour before dawn. From an open window high up on the 3rd floor came the sound of a baby settling, a small complaint, then quiet. On the pavement below, a cat crossed from one side to the other without any hurry and disappeared into the black mouth of a stairwell. The stairs behind it went up steep and narrow between plastered walls, and every landing had its own smell. Cooking oil on the first, damp on the second, and higher up only the dry, warm smell of brick that had been in the sun all day. A pair of sandals stood outside a door on the second landing, set neatly side by side, and behind the strip of cloth that hung across the opening, there was no sound at all. Behind the street fronts stood the warehouses, and they were the real business of the town. Their doorways were high and narrow, and set deep into walls a full brick-length thick, and inside the grain lay in bins that ran back into the dark further than a lamp could show. It lay in drifts against the partitions, dry and cool, and it made no sound at all, except when a man walked on it, and then it whispered and gave under him like sand. The floors were raised on low pillars so that air could move underneath and keep the damp from coming up, and the whole building breathed slowly through its own foundations. A guard walked the aisle with a lamp in one hand, and the light woke a shine along the tops of the bins and then let it go again. On the doorpost, cut small and neat, were the tally marks of the last delivery. The grain nearest the door was the oldest and would go first, and the whole windowless building existed to keep it dry and dark and still until its turn came. There were 4 cats asleep on a folded sack by the door, and their being there was as much a part of the arrangement as the locks and the seals, and better paid attention to. At the wharf, the barges lay nose to tail along the bank, broad and shallow and heavy in the water, waiting for the tow upriver. They were not sea-going ships. Their business was the 20 miles of brown water between here and the city, and they went up under the pull of oxen walking the towpath on the near bank, 3 and 4 beasts to a barge, moving at the speed of a man strolling. The tow ropes lay coiled on the decks now, still damp. A bargeman sat on the gunwale of the nearest one, with his feet hanging over the water, eating bread and looking at nothing. His barge had a shrine no bigger than a hand, nailed to the mast stump, the wood around it worn pale, where hands had touched it going past. The river smelled greener here than at the sea end, more of mud and willow and less of salt. In the morning the oxen would come down the path with their heads low and the drover walking at their shoulder, and the ropes would go tight and drip, and the whole slow chain of the river would start again. The city upstream would want its bread by the end of the week, as it wanted it every week, and this was how it came, not in one great ship, but in 100 flat-bottomed loads, creeping up a muddy river behind cattle. There was a square behind the theatre where the shipping trades kept their offices, 60 of them or more, in a colonnade that ran all the way round. Each office was hardly bigger than a shop, and in front of each one, set into the pavement, was a mosaic in black and white that said without any words what the men inside did and where they came from. A merchant ship with its sail bellied out. A lighthouse of 3 shrinking tiers with a fire on top. A dolphin curled round an anchor. A pair of elephants walking for the traders out of Africa, and under many of them a name in plain block letters: Carthage, Alexandria, Narbo, Sabratha, Hippo, set into the floor of a small dark room in a small town at the mouth of a muddy river. Some of the floors were old and had been walked into a soft polish, and in one of them a corner had settled over the years so that the ship in it leaned very slightly, as though into a swell. At night the colonnade was empty, and where the open sky showed between the columns it laid long pale bars across the pavement, and the little black ships sailed on the white ground, exactly as they had sailed all day, going nowhere, going everywhere. The whole reach of the sea was written into that floor, and men walked over it without looking down. The Fire Watch had its barracks near the middle of the town, a courtyard building with a fountain in the middle and a shrine to the Emperor's guardian spirit at the end. The men who slept there were not soldiers of the town, but a detachment sent down from the city, 2 centuries of them, posted here for 4 months at a time before another turn came out to relieve them. Their work was the thing that everyone in a town of 4-story brick and wooden floors and open lamps thinks about last thing at night. 2 of them came out of the gate now, with a hand pump on a barrow between them, and the wheels went over the paving with a knock at every joint, and they turned down the side street toward the bakery quarter, because that was where the ovens were. They walked without talking. They carried a coil of rope, a bronze pump, a pair of axes, and a heap of coarse blankets soaked in vinegar. And every one of those things had been used within living memory. At the corner, one of them lifted his lamp and looked up the face of the building floor by floor, at the shuttered windows and the balconies and the black beams of the eaves, and looked for a long moment, and then lowered the lamp and went on. At the crossroads they stopped without discussing it, and drank from the public fountain, one after the other, from a spout worn concave by 100 years of the same hands. Then the barrow started knocking over the paving again, further off now, and went round a corner and was gone. And the street was as quiet as before, only with the small difference that someone had walked down it and found nothing wrong. The baths had closed at dusk, and the great rooms stood empty and still ticking with heat. The floors were laid over a forest of little brick pillars, and beneath them the furnace had been banked but not put out, so that the marble underfoot held a low warmth that would last until morning. In the dark, the vaults were enormous and invisible, and the only light came from a single lamp left burning in a niche near the door, which put a small, trembling shape onto the surface of the great cold water basin. That water lay perfectly flat. Every so often, a drop fell from the mouth of a lead pipe somewhere above and struck the surface, and the sound went out and round the empty room and came back changed. Underfoot, in the black and white of the floor mosaic, the sea god drove his 4 horses through a crowd of tritons and dolphins and boys riding on the backs of fish. And none of it could be seen at all in that darkness, and all of it was there. A slave came through with a rake and a basket to draw the ash forward, and the furnace mouth opened and threw a red bar of light across the corridor and closed, and the dark came back and settled. The bakeries worked at night because bread is wanted in the morning. In a yard off the side street, the millstones stood in a row, each one a heavy hourglass of grey lava, and each one had a blindfolded donkey harnessed to its beam, walking a circle it had walked 10,000 times. The stone turned with a low, continuous grinding note that could be felt in the soles of the feet from the street outside, and the flour came out warm and pale into the trough below. Inside, men worked the dough on long marble slabs, folding it and turning it and pressing the heel of the hand into it in a rhythm that never varied. And the room smelled of yeast and hot brick, and the sharp, clean smell of flour dust in the air. The oven was a low dome of clay with a fire drawn back to its edges, and the loaves went in on a long peel, round and scored across the top into 8 portions, so that a family could break it into pieces without a knife. The first batch came out an hour before light. For that hour, the whole street smelled of new bread, and people asleep in the rooms above turned over and did not wake, and were glad in their sleep without knowing why. Under one of the houses, down a short flight of steps, there was a long, low room with benches built along both walls and a barrel vault overhead. It had been a storeroom once. The men who used it now had cut the ceiling with small holes and set chips of white stone into the plaster, so that when the lamps were lit, the vault came alive with a scatter of little points of light, and the room stood under its own small sky. At the far end, carved in relief and painted, a young man in a Persian cap knelt on the back of a bull and turned his face away. and a dog and a snake reached up toward the wound, and a scorpion held to the belly of the beast, and 2 torch-bearers stood at either side, one with his torch raised and one with his torch pointing down. The men sat on the benches facing one another across the narrow floor, and ate a plain meal, and said very little, and what they said stayed there. They were dock workers and clerks, and a customs official and 2 soldiers, and in that room they were none of those things. The plaster behind the benches had been rubbed smooth and slightly dark at shoulder height along both walls, which was the only record the room kept of everyone who had ever sat in it. The lamps were set low, below the level of the eye, so that the light went up the walls and the faces stayed in shadow. Above their heads the painted stars did not move, and outside, over the roof and the street and the flat black country beyond, the real ones did. Of all the stars over the sea that night, the ones the sailors watched for were the 2 that rose together, close and even, one a little brighter than the other. The story went that a queen of Sparta was loved by the greatest of the gods in the form of a swan, and that she brought forth an egg, and from the egg came twin brothers, Castor, who was mortal, and Pollux, who was not. They grew up inseparable. They rode together, hunted together, sailed with the heroes together after the Golden Fleece. And in all the tales, they are never named apart, always the 2 of them, always the brothers. One could be killed, and one could not. And for as long as they were young, this made no difference at all, and no one thought about it, in the way that no one thinks about it. They were simply the twins, and they were famous for their horses and their kindness to men in trouble. And they went everywhere side by side. Most of the great figures of the old stories were solitary. A hero on a road, a man against a monster. And these 2 were never that. Whatever came, it came to both of them. And a crew shut up together in a hull for 3 weeks understood that arrangement better than they understood anything else. Then, in a quarrel over cattle, Castor was struck with a spear and died, as mortal men die. Pollux held his brother and could not follow him because the part of him that came from his father would not let him go down into the dark. And for the first time in their lives, the difference between them meant something. He asked to die. He asked to give the gift back, to be allowed to be ordinary, so that he might be ordinary alongside his brother. And it is one of the few places in all the old stories where a god is asked for less rather than more. And the answer he was given was not a refusal and not quite a granting. He could keep the immortality, but he could share it. One day below with Castor among the shades, one day above in the light, and then turn about, and so on, forever. So the brothers were never together and never parted. As one rose, the other went down, and each of them spent half of all time in the dark, waiting for the other. And neither of them was ever alone in it. It was not a happy ending, and nobody ever pretended that it was. It was a bargain in which the loss stays, and is carried, and is halved by being carried by 2. Men who had buried a brother told that story to each other without ever saying why. That was why the sailors called on them. When a ship was taken by a storm at night, When the sea was standing up in black walls and the crew had long since stopped shouting, sometimes a pale light would come and stand on the tip of the mast, a cold flame that burned without heat and did not blow out in the wind. And sometimes there were two of them, one on each masthead. And every man aboard who saw it knew the brothers had come. The storm did not always stop. Ships went down with the lights burning on their masts, and the men of the port knew that as well as anyone. But the lights meant that in the worst hour of the worst night, the crew were not by themselves out there. And for men who worked the sea for a living, that turned out to be the thing they most needed to be told. One light meant the brothers were divided that night. Two lights meant both were above, and that was the best luck a ship could have. And a man who had seen it once would tell about it for the rest of his life. Near the river, in a small precinct of its own, stood the temple where the town kept the brothers, and its steps were worn into hollows in the middle where the feet had gone up for 200 years. Their festival was in the depth of winter, when nothing sailed, and the precinct on this September night was quiet and unlit, except for one lamp inside the doorway. On the shelf along the back wall stood the offerings, a bronze anchor no longer than a hand, a plaque with a name and a date and a word of thanks, a lock of hair in a twist of cloth, and a small ship carved out of pale wood, with real thread rigged from its yard, the work of a long winter. An old man had come up the steps and stood there a while with his cap in his hands. He had been a rope maker on the wharf for 30 years, and before that he had been at sea. And he had been in one storm off Sardinia in his second year that he had never in all that time described to anyone. He put a coin in the box and touched the rail of the little wooden ship with one finger, and went back down the steps into the dark, and slept well that night, as he generally did. The lamp inside the doorway would burn until about the middle of the night, and then go out, and the offerings would stand there in the dark on their shelf, the anchor, the plaque, the twist of hair, the little rigged ship, until the light came round again and found them. Down at the moorings, a ship was making ready for the last run of the season. After the middle of November, nothing would sail. The sea closed, and the trade lay down and slept until spring. And the men who worked it mended nets and drank and grew restless and waited. So this crew were going out on the land breeze before dawn, down the last reach of the river and over the bar and out, bound for the African coast and back before the weather turned. The mate went along the deck with a lantern checking the lashings, one hand always on something solid. On the quay, the master's wife stood with a folded cloak over her arm, and neither of them said very much, because it had all been said in the house already, and the rest of it was not for the quayside. Somebody laughed once further up the wharf, and it carried a long way over the water. Then the lantern went below, and the ship lay dark and ready, lifting a little and settling again, and the river went on past her toward the sea as it had all night. In the last hours, the sky turned the way it does without anyone watching it. The great summer stars slid down into the west and went out one by one over the sea, and behind the town, low in the east above the flat land and the marshes, two stars came up close together and climbed slowly, one a little brighter than the other, exactly as they had done since before there was a town here at all. The air off the land began to move before the light did. Along the wharf, the moored barges swung by degrees and lay the other way, and the ropes creaked and went slack and took up again. In the streets behind, the lamps in the niches had burned down to a low blue and gone out one by one, and the fire watch had made its last round and stood at the corner of the main street with nothing to report. The bread was in the ovens, the grain lay quiet in its bins, with the cats asleep on the sacks, and the little black ships sailed on across the white floor of the empty colonnade. And away in the east, the two brothers climbed steadily into a sky that promised a calm sea. The town slept the way a working town sleeps, all at once and completely, with the whole weight of the next day already waiting on the other side of it. The warmth came out of the brick walls slowly and went up past the balconies into the dark. Down in the vaulted room under the house, the lamps had been put out hours ago, and the chips of white stone in the ceiling held nothing now, and the painted stars waited in the black for the next time. The furnace under the baths ticked and cooled. The river ran out to meet the sea with the whole of the night on its back, and the sea took it without a sound and carried it away flat and grey toward the first light. On the masthead of the ship at the moorings, there was no flame, because there was no storm, and there was not going to be one, and the brothers stood clear and steady in the eastern sky and kept their watch as they always did, one of them rising while the other one rested, and neither of them alone.